Have you ever stepped into a place so quiet, so still, that it felt like the whole world was holding its breath? Maybe it was an old wooden shed behind your grandmother's house, or a sun-dappled porch where no one had sat in years, a place where the air seemed thicker with memory, and time moved just a little slower. There are places like that, quiet corners of the world where nothing urgent ever happens, yet everything important somehow lives on. They hold the scent of cedar and soil, the warmth of afternoon light slipping through dusty glass, and the kind of silence that doesn't ask anything of you. Tonight, I'd like to take you to such a place, a garden shed at the edge of a field, where an old man returns each morning, not out of habit, but because that's where the stories still breathe. So get comfortable, let your shoulders soften and your thoughts grow quieter with each breath, because a light is about to come through the window, and our story begins. Some mornings arrive like whispers. They don't knock or rattle the windows. They don't rush through the curtains or scatter light too quickly across the floor. They simply drift in, soft and pale, like breath on a cold window pane. This morning is one of those. The air smells faintly of last night's rain, though the skies are clear now. There's a hush across the fields, the kind of hush that makes you believe the world hasn't quite woken up yet, and maybe it doesn't need to, at least not for a while longer. Thomas doesn't set an alarm. He hasn't in years. His body wakes when it's ready, which is usually just before the light turns from silver to gold. He lies in bed for a while, blinking slowly, listening to the small creaks of the house adjusting to the weight of a new day. There's a rhythm to it all. The way the floorboard in the hall settles first, then the sigh of the kettle as it cools on the stove, and the distant coo of mourning doves somewhere near the woodpile. Jasper, his old black dog, is already awake, curled in his usual spot near the back door. He lifts his head slightly as Thomas walks by, tail thumping the wooden floor once, just once, before resting again. Thomas makes coffee slowly, scooping the grounds with a worn wooden spoon, pouring water from a kettle that's seen better days. The coffee maker clicks and hums in the quiet, and he leans against the counter, breathing in the first warmth of the day. There are no emails to check, no meetings, no list, only the path, the same path he's walked for most of his life, from the back door, past the lilac bush, along the worn edge of the fence, beneath the crooked walnut tree that leans ever so slightly toward the sun. The mug is warm in his hand as he steps outside, and the screen door creaks just enough to say good morning. Jasper follows a few steps behind, his movement slower now, but still steady, still sure. The dog never runs ahead anymore. He walks like a companion who knows the journey isn't about arrival, but about how the earth feels beneath your feet. The grass is damp, soft beneath Thomas's boots. Each step presses gently into the soil, not so much a footprint as a conversation. The garden shed waits at the far end of the yard, half hidden behind a cluster of blackberry brambles and honeysuckle vines. Its wooden frame leans a little to one side, as if listening for something. The paint has long since faded into a comfortable hush of gray-blue, and the window, round like a watchful eye, catches the first light just as they approach. He pauses at the door, not out of hesitation, but respect. There's something about that shed, something that asks you to take your time, to slow your breathing, to remember. The key is still tucked inside the rusty flower pot beside the step. He turns it in the lock and pushes the door open with a slow creak, not unlike the sigh of someone easing into a favorite chair. Inside, the air is cooler, Still, it smells of wood and time and something faintly sweet, perhaps old lavender sachets long since hidden in drawers. Dust floats like tiny planets in the slant of morning sun. It is not the kind of dust that speaks of neglect. It is the kind that only gathers where life has been lived slowly, the kind that makes you wonder what stories are resting beneath it. Thomas steps inside and lets the door drift gently closed behind him. There is no need for light. The sun knows its way through the shed, casting long lines of gold across the shelves, the floorboards, the jars filled with nails and screws and odd buttons. He sets the coffee mug down on the workbench. It lands with a soft, hollow thud, familiar, reassuring. There are tools on the wall, old ones, each with its own history. A wooden-handled trowel stained dark from years in the soil. A pair of shears wrapped in a bit of cloth that once belonged to his wife's apron. A mason jar filled with mismatched screws and one brass thimble that belonged to his grandmother. He doesn't touch them yet, not out of fear, but reverence. Instead, he walks slowly to the corner of the shed where an old rocking chair sits beneath the window. It's a chair that has held many seasons. It groans a little as he lowers himself into it, but not in protest, more like recognition. It knows him. Jasper settles at his feet, curling into a silent heap, breathing the way dogs do when they know their person is safe. The chair rocks gently, barely moving. Thomas watches the light rise through the window as it paints a golden crescent on the far wall, just above the shelf where he keeps an old thermos and a photo in a cracked wooden frame. The photo is a bit faded now, edges curled, corners soft. It shows a woman sitting on the porch of this same shed, her face turned slightly away, smiling at something unseen. Her hair is pulled back in a loose braid. There's a mug in her hand and sunlight on her shoulder. She's been gone for 7 years, but the shed remembers, and so does Thomas. He doesn't speak her name out loud, not because it hurts, but because some things are best spoken through silence. He leans back and closes his eyes. Outside, the birds are beginning to stir. A sparrow chirps once, then falls quiet again. The breeze shifts the honeysuckle just enough to carry a whisper of sweetness into the room. It's the kind of morning that doesn't ask anything of you, the kind that lets you sit and just be. No noise, no tasks, no need to explain, just the light and the chair and the gentle rhythm of memory. And for now, that is more than enough. The shed doesn't speak. It doesn't creak often or shift in the wind the way old barns do. It holds its breath in the way that old trees do, with patience, with rootedness, with a stillness that seems earned. Thomas remains in the rocking chair, one hand resting gently on Jasper's back, the other cupped around what remains of his coffee, now only lukewarm. He doesn't mind. The mug is familiar in his hand, its shape, the chipped rim, the faint stain on the handle where paint once splattered long ago. These are the sorts of things that only matter when you've lived slowly enough to notice them. The light through the round window has risen slightly, casting a golden bar across the back shelves. A stretch of worn pine that holds more than tools. It holds small, quiet things, things that aren't valuable by price or rarity, but by story. He stands now, carefully, not rushing the movement. His knees have their own thoughts about mornings, but they do not protest today. Perhaps they too understand that what happens in the shed is different, gentler. Jasper stays curled, opening only one eye to track the motion before sighing again and returning to sleep. Thomas moves to the shelf without needing to look directly. He's been here too many times for it to feel like exploration, and yet somehow it never feels like repetition either. He reaches out to the small tin box in the far left corner. It's not much larger than a deck of cards. The paint is flaking, once forest green, now muted like moss after frost. The lid lifts with a soft scrape, and inside are a few buttons, a pencil stub, a matchbox with a single dried dandelion inside, and a folded piece of yellowed paper. He doesn't unfold the paper today. He knows what it says. It's a note his wife once tucked into his shirt pocket before he went off to help a neighbor put up a new fence. Don't forget to look up every now and then. There's always sky worth noticing. He'd kept it ever since, not because it was profound, but because it was her. Some mornings he reads it aloud. Today he only touches it with his fingers, as if to say hello. He sets the box back in its place, next to an old spool of twine and a glass jar filled with seeds that may or may not ever grow again. He moves along the shelf slowly, trailing one finger across the wood as he goes. A small birdhouse with peeling paint, a brass key whose lock has long been forgotten, a tin of rock candy he keeps meaning to throw out, but never does. There's a photograph tucked behind a row of canning jars. He pulls it forward, careful not to smudge the edges. The photo is black and white. A winter morning long ago, he remembers it instantly. His father standing beside a sled with a thermos in one hand and a carrot in the other, ready for the snowman. Thomas must have been 10 then. He can still remember how cold his fingers felt gripping the red rope of the sled, how the snow crunched just so underfoot, and how the sky had been the softest shade of gray, like a woolen blanket pulled just above the sun. The photograph doesn't make him sad, it makes him full of all the things that never needed to be grand to matter. He slips it back into its place. Some memories are better for being reshelved gently, not kept too close for too long. There's a small drawer beneath the middle shelf. He opens it now, slowly. The wood groans a little. Half complaint, half greeting. Inside are scraps of fabric, old nails sorted by size in tobacco tins, and, in the very back, a folded paper star. His granddaughter made it years ago on a summer visit when her hair still smelled of watermelon shampoo, and her laugh came too quickly to ever be caught in photographs. The star had been part of a larger game. She'd handed it to him and said, "This one's for wishes you're too tired to make." He keeps it here, where he can see it when he needs to. Thomas doesn't cry often, but he lets himself feel things fully. It's something he learned with age, that to feel a moment completely is to honor it, not to burden it. Outside, the breeze shifts slightly. The honeysuckle rustles against the side wall of the shed, and through a knothole, light filters in like a soft ribbon. He turns and sees that Jasper has stood up, stretching in that slow, arched way dogs do when they're easing back into the world from dreams. Thomas smiles. There is no urgency in this day, no calendar reminder or errand that cannot wait, only the steady breath of morning and the comfort of things kept in their rightful places. He pulls a wooden crate from under the workbench and sets it down beside the rocking chair. Inside, a small mending kit, a roll of twill tape, and a thermos of water. He removes a piece of worn canvas from the crate. It's faded at the edges, stained in spots from old oil and spring rain, but still strong, still useful. He sets to work slowly, patching a corner with thick thread and calm fingers. Each stitch is deliberate, not rushed, not mindless. Outside, a bird sings again, just one note this time, clear and bright as if to say, I'm still here." Thomas nods once as if answering a friend. Jasper lies back down beside the crate, and the morning continues, not with fanfare, but with presence. There is no music playing, no television, no chatter, only the hush of wood, the breath of dog, and the occasional hum of needle through cloth, the kind of silence that feeds the heart. And as the patch comes together, Thomas hums a tune so faint it barely disturbs the air. A lullaby his mother used to sing when he was too old for lullabies. But she sang anyway, because some songs are for the soul, not the ears. The shed holds the sound and keeps it safe. The shed always seemed to hold a kind of weather all its own. Not storm or sunlight, not wind or warmth exactly, but something softer, something more like memory than temperature, a kind of air that moved not with the wind, but with the turning of thoughts, the tilt of a head remembering something quietly from long ago. Inside, the world stayed the same, even as the years outside continued their slow unfurling. Children growing taller, fences leaning farther, fruit trees trading blossoms for bare branches and back again. The shed kept its steady stillness. Thomas liked it for that. He liked that the hammer always hung in the same place, that the drawer with sandpaper still caught on the left side, that the smell of linseed oil, cedar shavings, and time-worn canvas never truly faded. Some days it was this sameness that kept him steady too. Today he was mending things, not just the canvas from earlier, but also an old wooden stool that had stood loyally by the workbench for as long as he could remember. Its seat was cracked, not broken, just split in the way old things do when they've served through too many winters without asking for anything in return. He turned it gently onto its side, the legs clunking lightly on the floor, and ran his hand along the grain of the wood. It was smooth in places, rough in others, just like the people he loved. He sat beside it on the floor, cross-legged, his knees creaking in quiet protest before settling. A beam of late morning light slanted across the shed now, catching the floating dust in its path and making it shimmer. Not like glitter, not like sparkles, but like the gentle breath of something sacred. Jasper had moved closer, his chin now resting on Thomas's boot, his eyes half closed, one ear twitching occasionally at the sound of a fly passing by like a lazy violin note. Thomas reached for a small tin of beeswax. The label long gone, but the scent still pure, still sweet like honey warmed by the sun. He worked slowly, rubbing the wax into the wood with his thumb, then folding an old rag and pressing it into the cracks. The motion was simple, but not thoughtless. There was something about mending that made you remember, not just the object in your hands, but all the hands before yours, and the hands that might come after. This stool had belonged to a father before him, and before that to a neighbor who had once traded it for a basket of peaches and a jug of cider. That was the kind of currency people used then. Fruit, time, kindness. He smiled at the memory, not of the trade itself, but of the way his father had described it. A morning so hot the porch boards had softened, peaches so ripe they left juice on your knuckles before you bit in. The stool wobbled slightly as he pressed on one leg, not from weakness, but from being slightly uneven, as if, like him, it had a favored side. He reached for a folded bit of burlap and slipped it beneath one leg, then tested the balance again. Better. He would leave it like that. Sometimes balance isn't about perfection. It's about tenderness, adjustment, listening. The kettle on the hot plate behind him gave a low hiss, a just steam escaping from metal, a soft sigh into the air. He poured a small bit into a tin cup, not tea, just warm water with lemon peel, left over from yesterday. He sat on the mended stool now, testing its steadiness, and stared out through the round window again. Outside, the wind had picked up slightly. The tips of the tall grass swayed like tired dancers, and the shadows of the walnut tree leaned long across the garden path. For a moment, he thought of how many times his feet had walked that path, in boots, in slippers, barefoot once when the hose had burst in summer, and the yard had become a muddy invitation to remember being a child again. He thought about how that same walnut tree had once held a rope swing, now gone, but the knot mark still faintly pressed into the branch. His granddaughter used to swing there when she was smaller. Hair flying like wheat in the wind, feet bare, mouth wide with a laugh that only childhood can make. She hadn't been to visit in a while. Life had grown busier for her as it does. Thomas didn't mind. He never expected people to remain always near. He only hoped that when they did return, they'd know they were coming home to something that had waited. That was what the shed was for. Waiting without complaint, holding without clinging, welcoming without question. He took another sip from the tin cup. The warmth spread down his throat slowly, like sunlight melting morning frost. He looked again at the back shelf where a small tin wind-up bird sat beneath an old lamp. Its wings were folded in, and one eye had been scratched slightly from years of use. It had belonged to his son. He remembered winding it up and placing it on the kitchen table, back when the house had more noise, when chairs scraped on floors and silverware clinked, and the smell of cinnamon toast filled the corners. The bird would hop forward with a stuttering rhythm, its little metal feet ticking against the wood. His son used to follow it with such awe, as if she expected it to lift off and fly away for real. Thomas stood and walked slowly to the shelf. He picked up the bird, cupped it in his hand, cool to the touch, slightly heavier than he remembered. He didn't wind it, he just held it. Some things don't need to move to have meaning. Some things carry their story simply by staying. He placed it back gently, positioned the wings just so, and turned the small lamp beside it on. The bulb glowed weakly, amber and soft, casting a circle of warmth around the bird, making its shadow stretch long and bird-like against the wall. Outside, the sky was turning toward afternoon. Not bright, not rushed, just a little fuller, like a breath drawn before speaking. Thomas turned toward the door, opened it slowly, not to leave, not yet, but to let the air pass through, fresh air with the scent of earth and green and the faint trace of dew on cedar bark. Jasper rose and stretched beside him, tail wagging once, then again. The dog stepped outside first, settling into the patch of sunlight that always formed just beside the lilac bush this time of day. Thomas remained in the doorway, one hand on the frame, the other in his pocket, thumb tracing the edge of that folded note again. He didn't say anything, didn't need to. The shed said it for him. You are here, you are held, you are remembered, and that, for now, was everything. The light that enters the shed in the early afternoon isn't quite the same as the morning light, where the morning is hush and hush alone, soft as a woolen blanket folded across your lap. The light of early afternoon arrives slower, as if it has walked a long way to get here. It doesn't rush in, it leans, it presses itself through the round window like an old friend who doesn't knock, but knows the place is open. Thomas, still standing at the door, notices the shift. Yeah, he's not looking for it. But when you've lived long enough in the same rhythm as the land, You notice the way light turns corners. It falls now across the shelf of canning jars, dancing slightly on the glass, turning the dust into something almost golden. The warmth reminds him to sit again. Jasper has returned to his spot by the door, half in sun, half in shade. His breathing is slow, the kind of slow that animals trust the world enough to keep. Thomas reaches for the stool again, the one he mended that morning. It holds him without complaint, no wobble, no groan. Outside, a crow calls from the walnut tree, just once, and it's enough to open the door of memory once more. It had been many springs ago. He remembers it because the lilacs were just starting to bloom, not in full perfume yet, but enough to scent the breeze like a promise. That year, his granddaughter, June, had come to stay with them for a week during her school break. Her parents had needed time, the kind of time couples sometimes need when the air in their house gets too quiet in the wrong kind of way. June was 5 then. Small, quick-footed, a little whirlwind with paint on her fingertips and questions stacked one on top of the other. She had followed him everywhere that week, into the garden, into the barn, and finally into the shed. At first she'd wrinkled her nose at the smell. "Why does it smell like pencils and socks in here?" she'd asked. He had laughed. "Because it's full of wood and time." She didn't understand then, but she'd nodded as if to say she would try to. And by the 3rd day, she'd claimed the shed as hers too. He'd given her a drawer, the shallow one beneath the workbench. She filled it with leaves shaped like hearts, a blue marble and a spoon she insisted was magical. That drawer was still there now, still full, still hers. He hadn't moved a thing. Thomas stands again slowly and walks the few steps to the drawer. His knees make a soft sound, but no complaint. He slides the drawer open with care, as if not to wake something sleeping. Inside, the marble still blue, still bright, still cool under his fingertip. The spoon, slightly tarnished now, but with a shimmer near the handle where she used to grip it tightly and declare spells to turn sawdust into sugar or twigs into toffee, and a folded drawing crumpled slightly at the corners, a house with crooked windows and smoke rising like swirls of music, a girl with arms too long and hair like a sunflower explosion, and beside her a man with a beard holding her hand. She had written beneath it in large, careful letters, "Grandpa and me in the shed, no moms allowed." Thomas smiled at the spelling. She had always been a stubborn speller. She preferred the way things sounded to the way they were told to look. He refolded the paper and placed it gently back where it belonged, not to put it away, but to let it rest. He heard gravel then. Not loud, but different, the sound of tires over the driveway stones, slow. Jasper lifted his head. Thomas walked to the door, still open, and looked across the field. A car, dusty, blue, small. He squinted. The sun had tilted now, and the glare off the windshield painted the car in gold. But he knew that car. It had been years since it came down this road. By the time it came to a stop, he was already halfway across the yard, walking, not quickly, but with purpose. The driver's door opened, a figure stepped out, hands at her sides, a little hesitant. He knew her by the shape of her shoulders. She hadn't been 5 in a long time. Now she was 22, hair pulled back but not tightly. Her mother's eyes, but not her mother's weariness. "Hi, Grandpa," she said, and he didn't answer right away. He didn't need to. Instead, he opened his arms, and she came in, fitting into the space where a memory and presence overlap. Later, they sat in the shed together. The stool for him, the rocking chair for her. She held the spoon in her hand, turned it slowly like a relic. "You still magical?" she asked. "Only if you believe the right kind of things," he said. She looked around, at the shelves, the tools, the quiet. "It smells the same." "It always does," he said. She paused. "I thought maybe it would feel smaller." "Does it?" "No," she said softly. "It feels just right." They talked then, not urgently, not deeply, just the way two people talk when there's enough space between words to breathe. She told him about school, about a boy she used to like but doesn't anymore, about how she missed the swing. He told her about the walnut tree, about the birds, about the stool that still remembered her kicking her feet from it. And when the light began to fade, when the dust in the air turned soft and blue, she stood. "Do you mind if I come back again?" she asked. He smiled. "June," he said, "there's not a moment in this place that isn't already waiting for you." She bent down, kissed his cheek. Jasper wagged once and followed her to the car. Thomas remained by the door of the shed, hand on the frame, watching the dust settle again. And in that quiet, he felt the light shift once more, not brighter, not darker, just more complete. Evening, when it arrives, doesn't knock on the door of the garden shed. It doesn't stride in like noon with its brightness and certainty. No, evening drifts in gently, folding itself into the corners, settling on the beams overhead like a soft shawl placed around the shoulders of the day. Thomas remained in the doorway for a long while after June had left. He watched the dust settle on the porch rail, the lilac leaves stir in the breeze, the path where her footprints still pressed slightly into the dirt, and the place where Jasper had stood beside her car. Head tilted, tail still, as if taking the measure of time in silence. Now, back inside, the shed has grown cooler. The warmth of the day lingers only where the sun last touched. A patch of light stretched long across the rocking chair, the edge of the workbench, the photo frame that still holds her grandmother's face. He doesn't rush to turn on the lamp. There's a kind of reverence that belongs to the last light of day. The way it slants low, brushing across old wood and familiar tools, making the air itself seem golden. To interfere with that too soon feels somehow impolite. So he moves slowly, placing the tin cup in the sink near the back wall, tucking a loose scrap of cloth into the drawer where the rags belong, setting the mended stool back beneath the bench with a quiet scrape of wood on wood, and then, from the top shelf, he retrieves the old leather notebook. The edges are worn soft, rounded from time and touch. The cover, once dark brown, has faded into the mellow tone of aged tobacco. There's a pencil tucked inside its pages, short, nearly used to the nub, but still sharp enough for the kind of writing he does now. Not fast, not clever, just true. He carries the notebook to the rocking chair and eases himself down slowly. The light outside is fading fast now, and soon he'll need the lamp. But not yet. The half-light is enough to begin. He opens to a fresh page. The paper is thick, a little yellowed at the edges, and it gives a slight whisper as he folds it back. He writes the date in the upper corner, not for record, just as a way of naming this moment, giving it a gentle anchor in the long drift of time. June came today. He writes it plainly, no embellishment. She looks taller than last time, still wears her feelings in her eyes, still turns a spoon like it holds secrets. He pauses, looks toward the shelf where the spoon now rests once more. Beneath the photograph, beside the folded drawing, Jasper stirs slightly at his feet, then sighs and returns to sleep. We talked of school and the swing and the way the shed smells the same. I told her it always will. I meant it. He rests the pencil on the edge of the page. The wind outside has calmed now. The walnut leaves make only the smallest sound, like an old book being closed gently in another room. He leans back, letting the chair rock just a little, not enough to disturb the air, only enough to remember. It had been his wife's idea to start the notebook years ago when his joints first began to ache in the cold and the mornings came slower. She'd said, write it down, even if it's nothing, even if it's just how the sun looked coming through the window. At the time, he'd laughed. What good is a notebook full of weather and light? She'd shrugged. Notebooks don't need to be useful. They just need to be true. And so, he had begun. A few lines each evening, sometimes more. Not every day, but enough that when he turned back through the pages now, he could see the quiet map of the years, a trail of thoughts and moments stitched together by sunlight, by bird song, by the simple fact of being here, still. He turns back a few pages now, not searching, just grazing, a page about the first frost last October. The pumpkins looked surprised, the leaves all curled into themselves like cats. Another from midsummer. June bugs tapping on the screen door. Jasper watching them with one eye. I think he dreams of flying sometimes. And one long ago from when the shed roof had first started to leak. Water makes a sound like kindness when it drops slow enough. He closes the book gently. The day is almost done. Outside, the sky is turning a deep indigo, the kind of blue that comes only after a good day. A day that asks nothing more than for you to be present. He reaches for the small oil lamp near the window, lights it with a match. The flame flickers once, then settles into itself, soft and golden. Its glow fills the room gently, pushing back only as much dark as it needs to. He sets the notebook on the workbench, not hidden, not displayed, just resting, like the stories it holds. Thomas walks to the door of the shed again. The night has come now, not heavily, not with a rush, but with a deepening. Crickets have begun their song in the grass. A barn owl calls from somewhere down near the creek. The scent of evening is in the air, cooler, a little damp, with the faint trace of wood smoke in soil. Jasper stands beside him, tail low and content. They do not speak. They simply stand there, two silhouettes against the last light of day. And after a while, Thomas turns off the lamp, closes the door, and leaves the shed just as it has always been. Not empty, but holding time, holding stories, holding silence the way some people hold hands, gently, with reverence, and without letting go too soon. Morning returned not with ceremony, but with the gentleness of something that had never truly left. It entered the garden quietly, stepping lightly across the fence line, threading its fingers through the branches of the walnut tree, pausing at the windowsill of the little garden shed, as if remembering where it had last been. Thomas stirred before the light reached the window, not because of any sound or alarm, only because his body had learned over many seasons how to wake with the earth. The house was still. The walls held the warmth of the night, and the floors, though old, didn't complain as he moved barefoot across them. Jasper lifted his head from the rug by the back door, yawned soundlessly, and fell into step behind him, not in hurry, not in need, just present. Outside, the grass was damp with dew. Thomas noticed it by feel, not sight. The way the cool wetness settled around the soles of his boots and whispered its way upward through the soft fabric of his pant legs. It was a quiet morning, Even the birds were slow to begin. They'd sing eventually, but not yet, for now it was the wind's turn. A soft wind, not restless, the kind that carries memory in it. It passed through the tall grass in long waves, brushing gently against the wildflower stems that leaned sleepily toward the shed, as if they, too, had woken slowly from a peaceful dream. The door to the shed, when he reached it, gave its usual sigh, a low, contented groan like a well-loved chair leaning into your weight. Thomas paused in the threshold, as he always did, to take in the scent of the place. Even after all these years, it still met him the same way, a mix of earth and wood, of old paper, beeswax, and the faintest trace of lavender that had once come from a sachet tucked into the drawer by his wife. Now long gone, but somehow still lingering. He stepped inside, and the floor accepted his weight with a familiar creak, like an old friend acknowledging another visit. Jasper followed, curling into his usual place by the stool, nose resting between his paws, eyes half open, half closed. Thomas didn't turn on the lamp. The early light was enough. It moved softly through the round window, slanting across the workbench, touching the edge of the rocking chair and lighting up the old notebook where he'd left it the night before. He didn't reach for it yet. Instead, he stood still, hands in his pockets, breathing, not deeply, not intentionally, just breathing in the way people do when they are quietly grateful. The shed, for all its stillness, seemed to shift a little around him, not physically, but in tone, in presence. There was something about this hour, when morning had just begun to unfold, but the world hadn't yet remembered to be busy. That made the shed feel more alive than ever. He walked over to the back wall, where the calendar still hung, open to a month that was almost finished. Each square held small pencil marks, mostly weather notes or reminders to mend something, but a circle had been drawn around tomorrow's date. He remembered doing it. June was coming again. Not for long, just the afternoon. She'd said she had a few hours between work and dinner with friends and wanted to sit with them for a while. He'd told her she didn't need to bring anything, but he knew she'd show up with something in hand anyway. A jar of jam, perhaps, or one of those small cakes she liked from the bakery in town. He smiled as he looked at the circle. There is something about anticipation that made the air feel lighter, not because something big was coming, but because something simple was returning. He moved toward the shelves again, letting his fingers trail lightly along their edges. Each item held its place, as it had yesterday, as it had for years. There was comfort in the arrangement, not because it was efficient, but because it was familiar. A carved bird his son had whittled from pine. A jar of buttons sorted not by color, but by the stories behind them. A spool of thread once used to mend the collar of his wife's garden shirt. The one with the sunflowers stitched across the front that she'd insisted made her plants grow taller when she wore it. And beside it, the small square of fabric June had embroidered with crooked stars and the word home in letters that leaned to one side. He ran his thumb over the stitches. They had loosened slightly over time, not unraveling, just relaxing, like all things do when they are loved without being demanded. He returned to the rocking chair and sat down slowly, letting his weight settle gradually, the way he might lower himself into a quiet thought. The chair groaned once, then steadied. The light across the floor had shifted slightly, longer now, more golden. He watched the way it stretched across the grain of the wood, making each imperfection glow. It reminded him of the way dusk had once fallen on his father's hands as he carved the leg of a broken stool on the porch, the way his mother had stood at the kitchen window drying her hands on a towel, looking out into the orchard, unaware that she was being remembered. Some memories were like that, quiet, unposed, content to live in the background until called forward by the angle of light or the scent of something familiar. Thomas didn't write anything in the notebook this morning. He just sat with it nearby, like a friend he didn't need to talk to yet. Sometimes the presence of a thing was enough. The shed breathed around him. The wood creaked softly. Jasper sighed in his sleep. Outside, a dove began to call. Low and slow, a sound like peace made audible. He rested his hands on his lap, closed his eyes, let his thoughts drift the way the morning had. Unhurried, gentle, trusting, and in that moment, with nothing to do and nowhere to be but here, he felt what he always hoped others would feel when they visited this small wooden place, held. Afternoons in late summer have a way of holding time differently. They don't stretch out exactly, they deepen, as if the hours decide to fold inward, gathering themselves into something quiet and gold-edged, like a page turned slowly in a well-worn book. The day had warmed gently, not insistently, the kind of warmth that settled into the soil, rose into the rafters of the shed, and wrapped around the arms of the rocking chair like a shawl. Thomas sat just outside the shed now, on the little wooden step that led down to the grass. He'd brought the stool out earlier and left it under the eave, its surface now holding a small enamel plate with 2 butter cookies and a white mug filled halfway with mint tea. He'd picked the mint himself that morning, thin-stemmed and bright, still damp with dew when he'd plucked it from the edge of the herb bed just beside the old rain barrel. The breeze was slow, smelling of warm pine and something faintly sweet, perhaps the sunburned heads of the zinnias that leaned tiredly in the garden rows, their colors still bold even in their late blooming. Jasper lay nearby, sprawled in the shadow of the lilac bush, one paw twitching lightly in sleep. The shed door was open behind them, letting the afternoon light slip in and settle wherever it liked. Across the wooden shelves, the windowsill, and the notebook Thomas had left open on the workbench, its last sentence still unfinished. A sound on the gravel caught his ear, not loud, not out of place, just enough to turn his head gently in its direction. He knew the car by the hum of its engine and the way it coasted to a stop without revving, as if the driver too understood that some places ask for a softer arrival. June stepped out carrying a small glass jar in both hands. Inside were a handful of zinnias, their stems uneven, their petals curling slightly at the edges, in that way flowers do when picked with affection rather than precision. She wore a loose cotton dress and scuffed canvas shoes, and her hair was pulled back in a low knot, held together with what looked like a pencil. "Hi, Grandpa," she said, holding up the flowers like an offering. He smiled and nodded once. "Those from your mama's garden?" "She said I could take the ones the bees weren't using anymore." Thomas stood slowly, brushing the seat of his pants. "Good policy." She stepped lightly across the yard toward him. The sun caught on her bracelet, a strand of thread with a small copper bead, and flashed for just a moment, like a spark from something old and meaningful. She handed him the jar. He took it in both hands, careful not to spill the water inside. "They'll last a few days," she said, "but they look like they've already told most of their story." He nodded, looking down at the blooms, orange, magenta, and one that was nearly white but with a hint of lavender near the tips. "Sometimes," he said, "that's when they're at their best." They sat together on the step, no urgency, no agenda. She sipped from his tea. He nibbled at one of the cookies. Jasper stirred, sniffed the air, then rolled onto his other side with a grunt of approval. For a while, they said nothing. They watched the way the wind moved through the grass, not quickly, but with a rhythm that made the blades sway like lullabies. "Do you ever get tired of this?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. Then, "Of what?" "This, I guess. The quiet, the stillness." He looked at her, really looked. Not just at her face, but at the way she sat, the way her shoulders rested instead of bracing, the way her hands didn't fidget the way they sometimes did when her mind was still too full of other places. "No," he said, "I think I've only just begun to understand it." She smiled faintly. "I think I want to." Later they moved back inside. She placed the jar of zinnias on the windowsill, turning it slightly so the tallest bloom leaned toward the light. Thomas poured more tea. The shed filled with the scent of mint in late summer. She wandered, lightly touching objects as she passed them. A wooden plane, a coil of twine, a tin box with a faded green lid. He watched her from the rocking chair, feeling no need to speak. Some afternoons aren't made for talking, they're made for remembering. She stopped beside the shelf where the small wind-up bird sat. "Still doesn't fly?" "Not yet," he said. She grinned. "Maybe one day." "Maybe." She moved on, humming something tuneless under her breath, and he thought for a moment how much she resembled her grandmother in that moment. Not in features, but in presence. The same ease in moving through quiet, the same reverence for the small. As the light began to fade, they sat again, this time inside. She on the stool, he still in the rocker. The zinnias caught the last of the sunlight. Their petals glowed faintly, as if remembering the garden from which they came. "Can I come again next week?" she asked. "You don't have to ask." "I know, but I like to." He nodded. "Then yes, you can come again." She reached down to scratch Jasper's ear. The dog opened one eye, just long enough to acknowledge the gesture. The room was quiet, but full, not of sound, but of something better. The kind of fullness that comes when nothing more needs to happen for everything to feel complete. She stood slowly. "I should go." "Stay as long as you like," he said. "I like just long enough," she replied, grinning. She bent to kiss his forehead, then slipped out the door into the early gold of evening. Thomas listened to the sound of her footsteps fading. Then he turned to the notebook, still open on the bench. He picked up the pencil, wrote, "June brought zinnias." They were fading, but full of light. Then he set the pencil down and watched the sun slip behind the walnut tree. Some mornings don't begin with light. They begin with scent. The dark, damp breath of earth as it stretches under the weight of early dew. The clean sharpness of mint leaves when crushed between fingers, the warmth of old canvas airing out in the sun. And then, once the nose has had its say, the ears wake to the hum of bees already moving among the clover, the hush of wind brushing against a garden fence, the long exhale of a rocking chair being nudged just slightly on a wooden porch still cool with shadow. Thomas had risen early again, not because of age, though age had its rhythms, but because there was something about this particular morning that asked to be witnessed. He'd felt it even before his feet met the floor, a kind of quiet invitation in the air, the kind that only came when something wanted to be remembered, or perhaps replanted. He stood now near the edge of the garden, holding a trowel in one hand, a half-empty mug of tea in the other. Jasper lay nearby, head resting on his paws, watching the slow movement of clouds across the sky with the deep patience only dogs and old men seem to truly understand. The garden rose had thinned since midsummer. Tomatoes had been harvested, the squash vines had curled back into the earth, their broad leaves now yellowed and soft at the edges. But there was still life here. A few marigolds blooming stubbornly near the fence, a cluster of basil hanging on, fragrant and eager, and in one narrow bed, the one nearest the shed, a patch of zinnias, their stalks brittle, their color fading into a kind of burnt elegance. Thomas knelt beside them. The dirt was soft, still warm from yesterday's sun. He cupped it in his hand, turned it over gently. There was something sacred in soil, not in a dramatic sense, but in the way it held things without judgment. Seeds, roots, mistakes, memories. It didn't ask which was which. It just held on and waited for whatever came next. He worked quietly, clipping away the dry stems, gathering them into a small pile to compost later. Then, slowly, he pulled a few weeds that had crept in. Not many, but enough to make the bed feel neglected. The rhythm of tending came back quickly, like a familiar song played on a quiet instrument. Dig, turn, smooth, pause, repeat. He didn't speak, didn't hum. Only the sounds of the garden moved with him. The scrape of the trowel, the occasional flap of a bird overhead, the gentle breathing of Jasper beneath the walnut tree. By mid-morning, the sun had climbed enough to spill gold across the fence line. Thomas stood and stretched slowly, his back giving a polite crack. From the shed, he brought a small packet, faded, the top folded twice and secured with a wooden clothespin. June had given it to him the week before. She'd found it in a box of old seed catalogs at a garage sale in town. On the front was a watercolor illustration of zinnias, full and cheerful, their petals wide like open palms. Inside the packet, a dozen or so seeds rattled softly like pebbles in a creek. He opened it carefully, poured them into his palm. Each seed was small, light, dry as paper. He knelt once more and with the end of the trowel, pressed a shallow line into the bed. There was no need for rulers or markers. The bed knew what to hold. One by one, he tucked the seeds into the soil, his fingers moving with the care of someone folding letters they'd waited years to send. He covered them gently, patted the earth down lightly, then filled a tin watering can and let the water fall in slow arcs, darkening the dirt like a blessing. Later that afternoon, June returned. She wore the same cotton dress as before, but this time carried a small cloth bag filled with clothespins, a notepad, and a pair of garden gloves too large for her hands. "I saw you working from the road," she said. He handed her the trowel without a word. They spent the next hour tending to the rest of the beds, trimming back what had faded, clearing space for what would come again. She asked questions. He answered some. Others he let drift on the wind, knowing the garden would answer in its own time. At one point, she paused, hands dirty, hair falling into her face. "I like this," she said quietly. "This what?" "This being with the earth. It doesn't rush me." "It never will," he replied. When the sun began to lower, they stood side by side, looking at the newly cleared bed. The soil looked darker now, richer, like it had been waiting to be seen. "Will they grow?" she asked. Thomas nodded once. "If we remember to come back." She smiled and wiped her hands on her dress. They walked back toward the shed together. Inside, the zinnias from last week still sat on the windowsill. Their colors had dulled, but not faded entirely. Their shapes had changed, but not collapsed. She picked one up, held it near the light. "They're beautiful," she said. "Still," he added. That evening, after she had left and the quiet had returned, Thomas sat again with his notebook. He wrote slowly, the way one peels an apple with a dull knife, carefully, deliberately, not minding the time. "We planted today. The earth was soft. She smiled when her fingers touched the dirt. That's all I needed." He closed the notebook, set it beside the jar of old clothespins, and leaned back. The garden outside held its breath, not from waiting, but from being full, and the shed, once again, listened. Evenings in late summer are quieter than most, not because the world grows still, but because the sounds it makes no longer call for attention. The wind in the trees becomes more like breath than voice. The birds offer shorter songs, as if satisfied that they've already said what needed saying. Even the insects, restless in their daytime buzzing, seem to settle into something more steady, more soothing, more background. It was that kind of evening now, the kind that invited memory not through nostalgia, but through rhythm. The kind that said, "You've been here before. Come, sit again." Thomas sat in the shed just beyond the open door, his legs stretched out before him, his shoulders wrapped in the old flannel blanket that had lived folded on the back of the rocking chair since spring. The oil lamp on the shelf flickered gently, casting a warm pool of amber light around the workbench. Outside, the last colors of daylight were slipping behind the walnut tree, pulling shadows across the garden one leaf at a time. Jasper was asleep in his usual spot, head heavy on his paws, the tips of his ears twitching in time with dreams. Thomas had not opened his notebook yet. Instead, he held a small square photograph in his hand. The corners soft, the colors faded to the gentle tones of memory. It showed a younger version of himself, shoulder to shoulder with a woman wearing a sun hat too big for her head and a smile that hadn't faded a bit, even now, decades later. They were standing at the edge of the garden just after turning the soil for the very first time. Behind them, the shed stood straighter then, its paint brighter, its roof still without sag. And in the earth before them, rows had been carefully marked with twine, the promise of something yet to grow softly held beneath the surface. He could still remember that day, not because it had been momentous, but because it hadn't. It had been ordinary, slow, sun-warmed, filled with the kind of quiet that settles between people who no longer need words to understand each other. They'd begun just after breakfast. The shed door had stuck that morning, swollen with the spring rain, and she'd laughed when he bumped his shoulder into it to get it open. "Well," she'd said, "that's one way to greet the season." He had shrugged. "It'll loosen by summer." "Everything does," she replied with that sideways smile of hers that meant she was talking about more than door frames. They had spent the morning pulling weeds and breaking up clumps of clay-heavy soil. She worked with her sleeves rolled past her elbows, her hands bare, her fingernails soon packed with earth. He remembered pausing once, just once, to watch the way her hair slipped from behind her ear each time she leaned forward. She caught him staring and said, without looking up, "You're not nearly as subtle as you think you are." To which he had responded, "I wasn't trying to be." By afternoon, the rows had been dug. They had planted together, kneeling in silence except for the occasional murmur. "Let's try marigolds here," or Do you think the basil will get enough sun? She had pressed each seed into the dirt as though it were a note being tucked into a pocket, something small but certain, meant to be found again later. When they were done, they'd sat just where he sat now, on the threshold of the shed, their backs against the door frame, their knees nearly touching. She had closed her eyes, lifted her face toward the sky and said, "I think this will be good." And he had believed her, because she never said such things lightly. He returned the photograph to its place on the shelf, leaned carefully between the spool of twine and a tiny ceramic cup that once held seedlings and now caught the occasional drip from the roof. The light was dimming further. The lamp's glow began to pull more attention to itself, gathering warmth in the shadows. He opened the notebook, let it fall naturally to a blank page. The pencil sat waiting in the spine, blunt from use but still willing. He began, "The soil still remembers. Even after all this time, it holds the shape of her hand." He paused, let the words sit, then continued, "I planted zinnias with June, in the same bed where we planted marigolds on that first spring morning. The lines haven't changed, only the hands that draw them." He looked up again toward the window. The jar of old nails on the sill caught the last thread of sunlight, and for a moment they shimmered like something far more precious than iron. He smiled softly and wrote, "Some things rust, others shine with time." Outside, the garden was quiet again, the beds dark with evening, the fence casting long shadows across the path. The zinnias they had planted yesterday, still only seeds beneath the surface, lay cradled in the warmth of the earth, not yet risen, but already remembered. Jasper stirred, lifted his head, then let it fall again. Thomas closed the notebook, set it gently back in its place. He didn't feel the need to say goodnight aloud. The shed knew, the garden knew, and somewhere beneath the layers of soil, so did she. Not all changes come like thunder. Some arrive with the hush of mist settling in a low field, with the turn of a leaf no longer green, with the way a robin hops twice before lifting into the sky, as if weighing the decision to fly but not rushing it. That morning, Thomas noticed change not through any grand sign, but in the way the air felt before the sun had touched it. It was a little cooler, still soft, but no longer warm at the edges, the kind of cool that lives near the end of summer when the earth begins to shift in its sleep. He stepped outside with his mug of tea, steam rising faintly, his hand cradling it like something breakable. Jasper followed, not eager, not slow, just present as he always was. The dew had come heavy in the night. It clung to the blades of grass and the curve of the garden path, gathered in beads on the wooden bench near the zinnia bed, and soaked the toes of Thomas's old canvas shoes within the first few steps. He didn't mind. There was something clean in it, something that made the whole yard feel like it had been washed and hung out to dry on a line between today and yesterday. He paused at the edge of the garden, just where the new bed of zinnias had been planted. Kneeling slowly, he set down his tea and placed one hand on the earth. The soil, still damp, gave easily beneath his palm. And there, just there near the edge of the row, a small green shoot had broken the surface. No fanfare, no trumpet of spring, just the quiet emergence of life in its most honest form. He smiled, not widely, but wholly, the way someone might smile when they hear their name spoken in a room after a long absence. The seed had listened. It had accepted the invitation to become something again. He remained there for a while, knees in the dirt, hand resting beside the sprout, watching the light spill slowly across the garden as the sun cleared the trees. Jasper sat nearby, head turned toward the same bed, as if he, too, saw the small miracle of growth and knew better than to bark about it. A few birds had begun their song now, not all at once, but in a kind of gentle call and answer that belonged only to the early hours. Thomas listened, not for what was said, but for what was offered. The day had not made demands of him, it had only arrived, like a friend who knocks softly, then sits beside you in silence, needing nothing but to be near. Later, back inside the shed, he wrote in the notebook. He didn't plan what to say, he rarely did. The words came the way seeds did, tucked in his hand before he even realized he'd gathered them. The first zinnia woke this morning. No one saw it but me, and Jasper, and maybe the wind. He paused, looked out the window. A squirrel ran along the fence line, startled a dove into flight. The air was still cool. It's not the blooming that matters most. It's the breaking through, the becoming. He closed the notebook gently, the way one might close the door behind someone who isn't ready to leave yet. Outside, he could hear the faint rattle of wind chimes from the porch near the house, a soft sound like glass exhaling. The shed smelled of cedar and cotton thread and the faint spice of the mint tea he'd brought in with him. He sat down in the rocking chair, leaned back slowly, and felt the rhythm of the day settle around him like a blanket that had been waiting just long enough. He did not sleep, but he let himself drift, not away from the world, but deeper into it, into the timbre of wood, the hush of morning, and the soft astonishment that something so small could push through the earth and begin again. Some afternoons settle like quiet rain on dry soil, not heavy, not loud, but full of presence. They don't ask anything of you. They don't remind you of all that's undone. They simply offer a little time, a patch of stillness, a soft seat in the sun. It was one of those afternoons now, the kind that arrives without knocking and lingers even after you think it's gone. Thomas sat on the back porch of the house, his legs stretched forward, his fingers wrapped loosely around a ceramic mug painted years ago with little blue forget-me-nots by someone who loved him. The tea inside wasn't hot anymore. It didn't need to be. It had steeped long enough to lose its sharpness, leaving behind something gentler, a warm quietness with just a touch of lemon. The same could be said of him, he supposed. June arrived not long after lunch. She didn't call ahead. She never really did. Not because she was careless, but because she knew her welcome never needed confirming. She came down the path with a wicker basket tucked under one arm, a folded linen napkin across the top, and a jar of honey clinking softly inside. Thomas watched her approach without rising, lifting his hand just once in greeting as she neared the porch. Jasper, already stretched beneath the bench, opened one eye and gave a single thump of his tail, then promptly returned to his nap. "Afternoon," she said, stepping up onto the porch. "Looks like you brought provisions." She set the basket down with a smile. "Lemon shortbread and peach jam. I got the peaches at the co-op, overripe, cheap, and sweeter than they ought to be." "That's the best kind of peach." She nodded. "They're the ones that don't expect to travel far." They sat together at the small wooden table just beside the porch railing, the surface slightly slanted from age, a faint crack running across the grain like a line in an old palm. Thomas poured more tea into her cup, added a slice of lemon, then a spoonful of honey from the jar she'd brought. She stirred slowly, the spoon clinking softly against the ceramic. For a while, they didn't talk. They just sat, letting the afternoon happen around them. A dragonfly hovered briefly near the wind chimes, then darted off. Somewhere across the field, a mower buzzed, its sound low and distant, like a memory from someone else's day. After a while, June reached into the basket again, pulled out a small square book wrapped in a floral cloth. "I found something," she said, "in the back of a drawer at home. It's hers." She laid the book on the table between them. Thomas didn't move right away, just looked at the shape of it. He knew it before unwrapping it, not by sight, but by feel. The way certain things return to you before you even touch them. When he did reach for it, his hands moved carefully, as if the fabric might dissolve. Inside, a soft-covered notebook, its spine slightly frayed, its pages smelling of paper and time. He opened it slowly. The handwriting was hers, not neat, but deliberate. Letters that leaned to the right, full of curves, always written with the pencil that left a faint smudge where her hand had rested. He turned to a page near the middle. June leaned closer, elbows on the table, her tea forgotten. The page was dated May 3rd, but no year. And beneath, in her looping hand, "The garden is finally in. Tomatoes in the far bed, basil near the kitchen window. We planted zinnias again. He doesn't know I tucked a marigold in the corner. He'll find it when it blooms and pretend he didn't know all along." Thomas chuckled softly. "I remember that bloom. Bright orange, bold as anything, acted like it belonged there." June smiled. "Guess it did." They read a few more pages together, not aloud, just sitting in the same memory from different ends of time. Some entries were lists, some were sketches of plants with their names misspelled. One page simply said, "He made tea today." Didn't oversteep it. Progress. That made them both laugh, soft and warm. Later they closed the notebook again, rewrapped it in the cloth, and June returned it to the basket like tucking in a child after a long day. The sun began to lower, its light stretched across the field, painting long shadows on the porch floor. Jasper rolled over with a sigh, his tail brushing the leg of the table. June looked out across the yard, toward the shed, the zinnia bed, and the slow quiet of a place that had held so many things. "This house," she said softly, "this place, it feels like it remembers everything." Thomas nodded. "It does, but it never tells the whole story at once." She reached for her cup again, sipped slowly. "Maybe that's the only way we can hold it." They sat there until the light faded from the sky and the first stars began to hum behind the thinning clouds. Then, with a slow stretch and one last spoonful of jam, June stood. "I'll be back Friday." "Same tea?" She smiled. "Maybe chamomile next time." "Bring the honey." "I always do." She leaned down, kissed his cheek, and walked slowly back down the path, the basket swinging gently at her side. Thomas remained on the porch. The tea had cooled, but his hands were still warm. He looked out into the darkening yard, the silhouette of the shed, the shape of the trees, the soft line where garden met fence, and then without rising, he spoke aloud, loud, not fully voiced, just enough for the night to hear. "Thank you." He wasn't sure who he said it to. The house, the garden, her, maybe all of them. Some evenings have a weight that isn't heavy. It rests on the shoulders like a woolen shawl, warm from the afternoon sun, familiar in the way a lullaby is familiar. Not because it's heard often, but because it's remembered gently. Thomas stood at the doorway of the shed, his hand resting on the frame. The evening breeze nudged the door slightly, and with it came that soft, persistent sound. A high-pitched creak, like a sigh held too long in the throat of old wood. He smiled at it, not annoyed, but thoughtful. "That hinge again," he murmured, his voice lost in the hush of the wind threading through the walnut branches above. He stepped inside, letting the door close behind him, not fully, just enough to muffle the breeze. The light was thin now. The sun had already slipped beyond the far hill, leaving behind only the bruised colors of twilight, violet smudges at the edges of the shed window, dust catching the last of the gold. He didn't light the lamp. There was just enough glow left for the task at hand. In the corner behind the shelves that held jars of buttons, twine, old keys, and a tin of mismatched screws, he found the small wooden toolbox. Its latch stuck a little, just like it always had, and he gave it the same soft tug that had opened it for the past 30 years. Inside, a small oil can, a stubby screwdriver, a folded cloth that smelled faintly of linseed and dust. He held the oil can up to the light, gave it a gentle shake. It sloshed faintly. Enough. He moved back to the door, squatted low, and with a tenderness one might use on an old violin, applied a single drop to the top hinge, then the middle, and then the bottom. The scent rose up, sharp and metallic, instantly recognizable. It carried with it the memory of summer repairs, fence gates long gone, and the faint tap-tap rhythm of a younger man fixing things not because they were broken, but because he could. He reached for the screwdriver, tightened the hinge screws one by one, each turn slow, deliberate, as though the door might remember every time it had opened to let someone in who needed a place to rest. When it was done, he gave the door a gentle push. It swung inward, smooth, quiet, like breath. Thomas stood back, brushed his palms on his trousers, and let his gaze wander the shed. The shadows had grown longer now, settling in the corners, gathering at the base of shelves where forgotten pots slept beneath burlap. He didn't move to turn on the lamp. Instead, he pulled the stool near the window, sat down, and listened. At first, it was only the wind, but then, faint and far off, the sound of a train whistle, long and lonesome, floating across the valley. He hadn't heard that in a while. The tracks were distant, used mostly for freight these days, but every now and then a sound found its way across the hills, carried by wind, by memory, by something older than either. He closed his eyes, let the sound stretch, let it pull something from within him. Not sadness, not longing, just a kind of hollow sweetness. There had been a time, years ago, when he and his wife would sit out on the porch just to listen for that whistle. They'd hold hands, not tightly, but in that easy way people do when they've long since stopped needing reasons. She'd once told him that train sounds made her feel safe. "Why's that?" he'd asked. "Because," she'd said, "it means someone's still coming home." The whistle faded now, swallowed by the quiet that followed. Thomas leaned forward, rested his elbows on his knees, and looked down at the floorboards. There, by his foot, lay an old brass tack. He picked it up, turned it in his fingers. He couldn't remember what it had fallen from. A frame? A drawer? But it didn't matter. He slipped it into his pocket. Some things don't need to be returned to their place. They just need to be carried for a while. Outside, the first stars had begun to blink through the veil of evening. The garden was still, the zinnias tucked in, their petals folded like hands at rest. Jasper stirred from where he lay outside the shed, gave a soft huff, then settled again. Thomas rose slowly, knees creaked louder than the hinge ever had, and stepped into the doorway. He looked back once toward the small space now behind him, the shelves, the tools, the smell of oil and memory, and then he closed the door. It gave no sound, just the quiet click of a latch that still fit after all these years. The morning began under a pale sky, soft and colorless like unwashed linen. It was neither warm nor cold, but carried that in-between feeling of days just before autumn, when the light feels thinner, as if the sun is learning how to be gentle again. Thomas rose earlier than usual, not because of any errand, he rarely had those anymore, but because his body had long learned to wake with the first stirrings of day. He moved slowly across the kitchen, his bare feet making a quiet shuffle on the old wooden floor. The kettle on the stove clicked once when he lit the burner. Jasper's tail thumped lazily against the doorframe, acknowledging that morning had arrived, but with no intention of rushing it. When the tea was ready, Thomas carried his cup out to the porch, where the air still tasted of night. The fields beyond the fence were wrapped in a low mist that clung stubbornly to the grass. He sat for a while, watching the fog lift one thin layer at a time. Each shift of light across the garden seemed to wake another memory, like pages turning in a book he had read many times, but never all at once. He thought of her again, his wife, not sharply, not as an ache, more like the faint trace of lavender that lingered on the linen chest upstairs, a memory that felt present without ever demanding attention. They used to sit on this porch together, especially on mornings like this, cool and still, when the first bird songs carried farther than they should have been able to. She always brought a book, he always brought the silence she filled. When the tea cooled, he rose and went to the shed, not for tools, but because something had nudged at his thoughts. A memory of an old book she used to keep out there, in a box with dried flower stems and folded recipes. It wasn't a novel, it wasn't anything special, just a simple collection of garden notes she'd scribbled over the years. But it was hers, and he wanted to see her handwriting again. The shed door opened easily now, its hinges oiled from the day before. It gave no sound, only the faint smell of the oil mingling with the warm scent of wood. Thomas stepped inside, setting his tea on the workbench, and began his slow search. The box was where he thought it would be, on the second shelf near the window, just beneath the coiled garden hose and beside a jar of clothespins. It was a wooden box, the kind meant for holding keepsakes rather than tools. The lid had warped slightly, but it opened with a soft push, releasing a small puff of dust into the air. That smell, paper, cedar, thyme, met him like an old friend. Inside lay the book. Its cover was worn smooth in places, the corners softened by years of handling. A ribbon marked a page in the middle, as if she had stepped away and never quite returned. He picked it up with both hands as though afraid it might crumble, and sat down on the rocking chair near the door. He opened to the ribboned page. The handwriting was hers, familiar, curving slightly to the right, every letter leaning forward, as if hurrying to meet the next thought. He traced one line with his finger, not to read faster, but to feel the weight of each stroke. September light is softer. The marigolds are turning their heads to the side. The tomatoes are tired now, but the basil is still hopeful. I think the earth rests differently in this month, as if it knows we're watching it closely before the quiet begins again. He read the lines twice, then closed his eyes. He could see her sitting at this very table, writing with a pencil that left faint smudges on the heel of her hand, her hair falling into her face, Her lips pressed together while she thought of the right words to describe the color of a sunset or the way the soil smelled after rain. Thomas turned another page. He fixed the fence today, said it didn't need it, but I think he likes the sound of a hammer just as much as the silence that comes after. He smiled at that. It was true. He had always liked fixing things even when they weren't broken. There was a kind of peace in giving attention to something that asked for nothing in return. After a while, he set the book down on his lap. The shed was quiet now, except for the faint hum of crickets and the occasional sigh of wood as it settled. Jasper had wandered in, curled at his feet, his breathing deep and slow. Thomas reached for his tea. It had cooled completely, but he drank it anyway. Outside, the sun had lifted the mist. The garden beds were brighter, their damp soil glistening like polished stone. The patch of zinnias, still young, looked almost shy in their morning stance, as though unsure if they were allowed to bloom just yet. He thought of planting more, not because he needed more flowers, but because planting felt like a conversation with both the earth and the past, something that said, "I'm still here, and I know you are too." Before leaving, he wrote a few lines in his own notebook, his pencil moving slowly, without hurry. Her words are still warm on the page. The shed keeps them like a secret. I wonder if gardens remember the ones who love them the most. He closed the book, patted it gently, and looked around once more. Nothing had changed, and yet everything felt different, because he had remembered. The day stretched forward, but he wasn't thinking of the hours ahead. He was thinking of how the light would turn gold near evening, how the zinnias might reach a little higher, how he might read her words again by the soft flame of the oil lamp, and feel, for a moment, as if she were still here. Just outside the door, humming softly as the wind carried her voice through the garden, the afternoon arrived in soft layers, like a quilt slowly unfurled across the valley. Not rushed, not bright, just quiet and warm enough to invite the windows open and stir the lace curtains with a gentle, almost absent-minded hand. Inside the house, Thomas was seated at the kitchen table, a pad of thick paper in front of him, his pencil resting beside a ceramic mug still warm from the second steeping of tea. Outside the open window, a sparrow called twice, then went silent. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if not to interrupt whatever he was thinking. He had not written a poem in years, not since the winter after she passed, when the silence inside the house had felt too wide to fill with anything other than memories. But today, for no particular reason, he found himself reaching for the old habit, the kind that doesn't demand perfection, only presence. The kind of writing meant not for publishing or praise, but for placing something gentle into the world. So he wrote, slowly, with pauses long enough to notice the way the light settled on the wood floor, or how the kettle pinged softly as it cooled on the stove. His hand moved unhurried across the paper. The wind today remembers how she hummed beneath the trees, not loud, not for anyone, just to keep time with the light. Zinnias bend to listen, though they've heard it all before. He smiled faintly. It was simple, but true, and maybe that was enough. He tore the page from the pad, folded it in half, and slipped it into the front pocket of his shirt without really knowing why. Later that day, June arrived again. A soft knock on the door frame, the familiar creak of the screen, her silhouette framed by the late summer light as if the day itself had carried her in. "Tea?" she asked, lifting her chin toward the kettle already warming. "You read my mind," Thomas said, motioning to the second cup he had already placed on the table. They didn't speak much at first. just shared the steam rising from their mugs, the gentle clink of spoons against ceramic, the kind of quiet that old friends hold like ceremony. Eventually, he pulled the folded page from his pocket and laid it beside her cup. "I wrote this today," he said. She looked at it for a long time before opening it, not out of hesitation, but the way someone might open a letter from a friend who hadn't written in years. She read the lines twice over, then set the page down gently. "It sounds like her," she said. Thomas nodded. "I wasn't trying to, but somehow it found its way there." "That's how it is with memory," June said. "It writes through us, not the other way around." They sat for a moment longer, watching the way the last of the afternoon light pooled on the kitchen tiles. Then, with the quiet boldness of old affection, June reached into her bag and pulled out a small brown envelope. Inside, a photograph. She passed it to him without explanation. It was old, creased at the corners, faded to the color of old lace, but clear enough to see the garden in full summer, the zinnias tall, the shed in the background, and his wife, kneeling in the dirt holding a bundle of basil, smiling not at the camera, but at something, someone, just out of frame. Thomas let out a soft breath, as if the image had pressed on a part of him he hadn't known was waiting. "I found it between pages of her garden journal," June said quietly. "I think she meant for you to find it later." He ran his fingers along the edge of the photo, careful not to smudge the surface. She always did know how to leave things where they mattered. The sun dipped behind the trees, casting soft shadows across the table. Jasper let out a contented groan from his spot under the window. Thomas reached for his notebook again, flipped to a fresh page, and began to write. Not a poem, not quite, but something between a thought and a blessing. June sipped her tea and listened, not to the words, but to the sound of pencil on paper, to the rhythm of quiet things being made with care and without urgency. And outside, beneath the zinnias still holding the last light of day, a breeze moved gently through the leaves, carrying with it the scent of basil, the trace of summer's breath, and the hum of a tune long since sung, but never quite gone. By the time June had left, her car easing down the gravel road with a wave from the window and a soft honk that barely stirred the birds, the sun was already settling behind the line of trees westward, stretching long shadows across the porch and spilling gold onto the faded floorboards as if to say, "There's still time." Thomas stood quietly for a moment, one hand resting on the back of the old chair where June had been sitting just minutes before. The photograph she'd given him lay tucked between the pages of his notebook, but it was already etched in his mind. His wife's hands full of basil, her face turned just slightly, caught in a laugh not meant for the camera. He didn't want to close the notebook just yet. Instead, he carried it with him, along with the picture, as he made his way through the kitchen, down the 3 back steps, and into the garden path worn thin by years of wandering footsteps in wheelbarrow wheels. The air outside had cooled, not quite autumn cold, but touched with the hush that comes when the day begins to release its grip. Jasper trailed behind him, slow and comfortable, with no particular urgency, his nails clicking lightly against the stepping stones. Thomas walked past the zinnias, now bowing their heads just slightly, their stems tall but easy in their stance, like old friends gathered in the fading light with nothing left to prove. He paused beside the small patch of thyme where the scent still rose sharply from the heat trapped in the soil. She had loved that scent, had always said it reminded her of something forgotten, though she could never quite say what. "It'll come back to me," she used to say with a shrug. "Everything important does." At the far end of the garden, beside the row of wooden posts where beans had once climbed, and now only a few dried tendrils clung like fragile threads, stood the spot where she had placed the old bench. It was a simple thing, 2 planks and a backrest, nothing carved, nothing fancy, but it had held them both year after year, side by side in the hour before dark. Thomas sat now, with the notebook open in his lap and the photograph tucked between its last few pages. The wind passed through again, barely rustling the dry corn stalks in the neighbor's field beyond, and carrying with it the mingled scents of earth, grass, and something sweet, perhaps the last of the honeysuckle. He didn't speak out loud, but the words formed anyway, in the quiet place behind his breath. "You always knew how to let things rest, how to let the day be enough." He traced his fingers over the photograph's edge, then let it rest on the bench beside him as if she might pick it up herself. In front of him, the garden breathed, not in any dramatic way, just the steady, living silence of things growing or fading, but still full of intention. He looked toward the row of marigolds and suddenly, without thinking, he whispered, "Did you hear the poem?" He chuckled softly, almost surprised at himself, but then, somewhere deep in the place where memory hums, he thought he felt it. Not a voice, not a sound, but a warmth, the kind that makes you feel as though someone just entered the room without saying a word. He reached for the notebook again, flipped past the blank pages, and stopped at the place where he'd written earlier in the day. He reread the poem once more. The wind today remembers how she hummed beneath the trees, not loud, not for anyone, just to keep time with the light. He looked up. The trees, tall and watchful, swayed ever so slightly, and the light, thinner now, lay across the tops of the fence posts like a shawl dropped gently from the shoulders of the sky. Then, on a new page, he wrote, "Evening speaks more clearly than noon. It leaves out the noise and carries only the names worth remembering." He let the pencil rest beside the paper. No need to write more, not now. The dog, sensing a stillness in him, moved to rest his head on Thomas's boot. The sky turned from pale rose to a deepening blue, like a page being turned slowly, revealing darker ink. He would rise soon. He would take the photo back into the house, place it where the light touched it in the morning, but not yet. For now, he sat with the fading day, with the poem, with the marigolds quietly listening. And somewhere in the hush, he imagined her voice. Not words, not sentences, just the sound she made when she exhaled at the end of a long, good day. By the time Thomas rose from the garden bench, the last thread of sunlight had already tucked itself into the crease of the western hills. The sky had deepened into that tender shade of navy that always came just before true night. A blue so soft it almost hummed. He stood slowly, his knees a bit stiff from sitting so long, but he did not mind. The stillness had been kind. He reached down for the photo beside him on the bench, gently brushing away a small curl of leaf that had drifted over its corner. As he picked it up, the faint warmth from the wood beneath it seemed to linger in the paper itself. It felt like she had touched it again. He slid the photograph back into the notebook, tucked the notebook under his arm, and gave a soft pat to Jasper, who stirred just enough to rise and follow. Their steps together on the garden path made no sound except for the faint crunch of gravel and fallen leaves. Inside, The house welcomed him with the smell of warm wood, tea leaves that still lingered in the kettle, and the cool breath of evening air slipping through the screened windows. He reached for the oil lamp on the shelf by the far wall, the one with the green glass base and the wick he'd trimmed just last week. Lighting it was a familiar ritual. Strike the match, tip the flame, watch the soft bloom of light unfurl like a quiet flower. The room accepted the glow, not as an interruption, but as something returned. He placed the lamp on the small table by the armchair, then hung his cardigan, soft from many washings, on the hook near the stove. There was no need for noise now, no radio, no hum of appliances, only the occasional settling creak of the house and the sound of Jasper's slow, circular pacing as he found the right spot to curl near the hearth. Thomas sat, not to read yet, but simply to let the moment settle around him. On the side table, beneath a small stack of old seed catalogs and 2 dried lavender stems, rested a worn envelope. One he hadn't touched in a while, though he knew exactly what was inside. A letter, her handwriting, folded twice, edges softened by time, ink that had blurred just slightly from fingers holding on too long. He picked it up. It was dated 10 years back, not from her final days, but from a summer evening not unlike this one. He had been away for a few days then, helping his cousin fix a roof in another town. She had written it and left it on his pillow before he returned. He unfolded it carefully. "Thomas, I made lemon tea today and thought of how you always say it tastes like sunlight in a cup. The zinnias bloomed this morning, bright as any you've planted. I left a few stems on the bench outside the shed. Thought you'd like to see them first thing. I miss the way you put your hand on my back when you passed behind me in the kitchen. Not because it's dramatic, but because it says, I'm here, I see you. We forget sometimes how much the quiet things matter. Come home, safe. M." He read it slowly, line by line, not to absorb the words, but to feel them, as though they had just been written and she were still in the next room, kneeling by the open window, clipping herbs into a bowl. The ache that came wasn't sharp anymore. It was round, worn smooth by years, a kind of presence that no longer demanded answers, only attention. He folded the letter again, placed it in the notebook this time, together with the photo. He will keep them side by side now, 2 voices from the same memory. The oil lamp flickered slightly, casting shifting shadows against the far wall. Shadows of chair backs, books, a branch outside brushing the glass. Thomas reached for his tea, now lukewarm, and took a sip. It didn't matter that the flavor had dulled. It was still lemon, still sunlight in a cup, just as she had said. He rested back into the chair, eyes closed for a moment, his fingers gently brushing the worn spine of the notebook resting on his lap. Outside, the crickets had begun their nightly song, not loud but constant, like the slow breathing of the earth at rest. In the distance, an owl called once, and then again from deeper in the woods. Thomas smiled. He remembered how she used to mimic their sound, playfully, standing by the porch with her hands tucked in her sweater sleeves, saying hoo-hoo with the kind of seriousness that made him laugh. It had been a small thing, but like she had written, we forget sometimes how much the quiet things matter. And so he sat there, bathed in the warm circle of lamplight, the folded letter resting over his heart, Jasper breathing deeply at his feet, and the house wrapped gently in the shawl of night. There was no music, no stories on the radio, just the hush of things that knew how to speak without needing to be loud. In that silence, Thomas felt something loosen in him, Something unknotted, something finally able to rest, not because the world had changed, but because he had remembered how to sit with it again. The morning arrived not with the fanfare of brightness, but with a quiet certainty, as if the world had simply agreed to begin again. The sky was still pale when Thomas stirred from his sleep, the room washed in that gentle kind of blue that only comes just before the sun truly rises. No birdsong yet, no wind, only the slow unfurling of light creeping across the floorboards, edging toward the braided rug at the foot of the bed. He lay still for a while, eyes half open, not quite asleep, not quite awake. The sort of in-between space where the heart doesn't try to think, but simply listens. Jasper had already risen, his soft steps padding out toward the kitchen in search of his morning drink from the bowl set near the back door. Thomas smiled faintly at the sound. There was something deeply comforting about how routines held, even when people did not. He sat up slowly, slipped his feet into the old wool slippers he kept just beneath the bed, and stretched his arms in the soft hush that belonged only to early mornings. The letter, still folded, lay on the bedside table. He didn't open it again, didn't need to. It had already settled in him. In the kitchen, he boiled water for tea, choosing the same lemon blend she had once called sunlight in a cup. The kettle hissed gently, and outside, a robin finally called out. A single clear note that felt like the beginning of something worth attending. With his mug in hand, he stepped out onto the porch, his cardigan pulled snug over his shoulders. The wood beneath his feet still held the chill of night, but the sun was climbing over the hilltop maples, painting the tops of their leaves in a quiet celebration of gold. He sipped slowly, no rush, just breath, just warmth, just the morning unfolding itself with nothing to prove. After a time, he walked back into the house, set his mug in the sink, and reached for the walking stick leaning near the door. The one she had given him one birthday years ago after he had twisted his knee on a trail near the creek. It was carved from a branch of black walnut, smooth to the touch, with a knot near the handle that looked like an eye watching over time itself. Jasper perked up at the sound of the screen door opening again, and together they stepped off the porch, down the slope of the backyard, past the shed, and toward the small wooden gate that opened into the field beyond. The field was theirs once, not in title or deed, but in memory. They had walked its edges countless times through all seasons, when the grass was tall and whispering, when the frost kissed its tips in silver, when wildflowers made every path feel like a secret gift. He remembered her there, standing near the fence, sunlight on her shoulders, hands wrapped around a thermos of coffee as she watched the clouds drift overhead like they were carrying stories from somewhere else. Now, as he stepped into that same field, he paused, not for grief, but for greeting. The grass was shorter now, clipped back by time and weather, but soft underfoot. Dragonflies hovered near a puddle left behind by last week's rain, and a pair of crows called to each other from the top of an old elm that had long since hollowed but still stood. Thomas followed the familiar path along the southern edge, where the fence line dipped and the trees parted to reveal a view of the hills in the distance. There was a stone outcropping there, flat, sun-warmed, a perfect seat for resting when the knees grew weary or the spirit simply wanted to listen. He took that seat now. Jasper lay beside him, nose tucked under paw, tail thumping once before going still. Thomas looked out. The fields rolled gently ahead, a blend of green and gold with patches of shadow where the clouds passed over. The wind arrived slowly, picking up the scent of clover and warm soil, carrying it toward him like a memory he had once known but never quite named. And there, just past the bend in the fence, grew the same small patch of daisies she had once admired for blooming late into the season. He smiled. "Still here," he said quietly, not to the flowers, but to something broader. The air, the sky, the space she had once stood in. He leaned back, his hands behind him on the stone, and closed his eyes. The wind moved through the grass with the sound of soft pages turning, and somewhere nearby, a honeybee buzzed in unhurried conversation with the wild mint. The world wasn't asking for anything, it was simply being, and that was enough. After a while, he stood again, stretching his back, and began the slow walk home. Jasper followed, loyal and gentle, his pace steady with each step. They didn't speak, didn't need to. Some silences are shared, not filled. As they passed the shed, Thomas paused, his fingers brushing the old wooden siding. The tools still hung inside, orderly and untouched. There was peace in that too, not in doing, but in preserving. He whispered, almost to the wall itself, "You'd like how quiet it is today." Back at the house, he let the screen door creak shut behind him, hung his cardigan on the hook, and returned to the table where his notebook waited. He flipped to a new page, and in careful script wrote only, "This morning I sat where she once stood, and nothing needed to be different for it to feel whole." He set the pencil down and let the page rest open to the light, now streaming in through the east-facing window. And somewhere in that stillness, beneath the hum of day beginning, a part of him settled deeper into the gentle knowing that not all loss is absence. Some of it stays, in petals, in paths, in the way the morning air knows how to touch your skin just right. The rest of the morning passed the way only quiet mornings can, not marked by hours or chores, but by a slow drifting of sunlight across the wooden floor, by the rustle of leaves outside the window, and by the calm certainty that nothing urgent was required. Thomas had returned from the field with the faint scent of grass still clinging to his sleeves. He had poured himself a second cup of tea, this time stronger, and let it cool without worry as he sat at the kitchen table watching the way the curtain moved with the breeze. Jasper had curled into his usual place near the cabinet with the extra blankets, his breathing deep and rhythmic, a soft presence that required no tending. There was peace in the stillness, but there was something else too. A nudge, as gentle as the breeze through the open window. It had been some time since Thomas had opened the small wooden box tucked away in the bottom drawer of the hutch. It wasn't locked, had never been, but he hadn't felt ready until now. Not because it held anything startling, but because of the way it held her. It was hers, not in a legal or possessive way, but in spirit. She had kept it in the hallway cabinet on the second shelf, beneath the old biscuit tins and beside the jar of buttons no one ever needed. Inside it, she had kept scraps of things, paper mostly, folded notes, clipped recipes, bits of poetry she had copied out in her careful cursive, a pressed leaf or two, sometimes the stub of a ticket from a train ride long past. Thomas rose from his chair, moved slowly toward the hutch, and knelt beside it, the wood cool beneath his palm as he slid open the drawer. There it was. The lid bore no markings, no carvings, just the soft wear of years. A slight discoloration where her thumb had always pressed when opening it. He carried it back to the table and sat with it for a moment before lifting the lid. The scent that met him was faint but familiar, a blend of old cedar, lavender, and something softer, perhaps paper yellowed by time. Inside, things were as she had left them. He hadn't rearranged anything. It didn't feel right, too. The topmost layer was a folded grocery list written in pencil, her slanted handwriting listing onions, cream, flour, and, at the very bottom, chocolate for you, because you always forget to treat yourself. Thomas smiled, folded the paper again, and placed it gently aside. Beneath the list was a stack of clipped poems, cut from newspapers, magazines, sometimes typed on the old typewriter they had kept near the bedroom window. One was marked with a small asterisk in the corner. He remembered her doing that when a line made her pause, or when she had intended to read it aloud at dinner. The poem read, "The wind does not ask to be remembered, but the trees do not forget. One gives, one carries." He read it again, slower, letting it settle. Then he turned the paper over and saw her note on the back. "Reminds me of you in the garden." There were small envelopes too, each containing a folded square of paper, like tiny letters never meant to be mailed. He opened one, carefully lifting the flap. Inside, a single sentence. "I hope the day you read this, the sun is gentle and you feel loved." He blinked, sat back in the chair, let the quiet wrap around him again. Not grief, not sadness exactly, but something more settled, like being wrapped in a shawl that once belonged to her, still carrying her warmth. Jasper stirred, as if sensing something, and padded softly over to sit by his feet. Thomas bent down, rested a hand on the old dog's head, and said, "She always knew what to say, didn't she?" Jasper gave no reply, only leaned in, the way dogs do when they understand more than they can express. Thomas reached back into the box and pulled out the recipe cards. Dozens of them, some smudged with flour, others still carrying the faintest trace of vanilla or nutmeg. He thumbed through them slowly. Apple cake, buttermilk biscuits, lemon poppy seed muffins with a note. "Bake these when it rains, best with tea." At the bottom of the stack was a folded napkin, soft from washing, wrapped around a slip of paper. He unwrapped it and found a list titled, "For Quiet Days." Sit in the sun, open all the windows, stir something slowly on the stove, or write someone a letter, walk without purpose, notice what's blooming, be gentle with yourself. Remember, even the sky takes breaks between storms. Thomas let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He didn't read further, not yet. The box would be there, tomorrow, and the day after. He didn't need to finish it all now. Some things deserved to be lingered with. He stood, walked the box back to the drawer, and placed it gently inside, but not all the way back. This time, he let it sit near the front, as if it might be reached for again before too long. Outside, the sun had risen fully, casting lines of light across the kitchen floor that seemed almost deliberate, like paths, like invitations. Thomas poured the last of the tea, warmed it slightly on the stove, and stepped back onto the porch. He didn't need to go anywhere, not today. The world had already come to him in the form of lavender paper, inked lines, and memories folded neatly like prayers. And as he sat, mug in hand, the breeze lifted again just enough to stir the edges of the curtain. It carried the scent of something blooming nearby, something sweet and familiar. The day had warmed without announcing it. It wasn't a sudden heat, nor one that pressed too heavily, just a quiet easing of the air, the way the sun begins to rest more firmly on the shoulders of the world as afternoon stretches into itself. Thomas stood by the kitchen sink, his hands wrapped gently around the bowl of flour he'd fetched from the pantry. its lid still bearing a faint chalk X drawn there long ago to mark that it wasn't sugar. The recipe card lay on the counter beside him, her handwriting neat, soft, and curved like ivy. It was her simple loaf recipe, the one she used when she wasn't expecting guests, but still wanted the house to smell of bread. He didn't really need the instructions. He had watched her make it so many times that it lived in his hands now, not in his head. But still, he kept the card beside him. It felt like company. Jasper had wandered to his favorite sunlit spot beneath the north-facing window, his body curled like a comma in the story of the day. Thomas worked slowly, not out of weariness, but intention. He stirred the warm water with a wooden spoon until the yeast dissolved, then watched silently as the mixture bloomed into life. The scent was subtle, earthy, and hopeful. Some days he thought of baking not as a task, but as a kind of remembering. The way the flour clung to her fingers was the same way time clung to memory. Soft, a little stubborn, always leaving traces even after you wipe the counter clean. Outside, the leaves had begun their quiet turning. There were still plenty of greens in the trees beyond the back fence, but the tips had started to glow amber, like the first shy flames of a long, slow-burning fire. A sparrow landed near the window. A small, plump thing with a chest puffed out like it had something urgent to say but chose silence instead. It tapped its beak against the glass once, then again, and Thomas chuckled under his breath. "You're a bit early for crumbs," he murmured, but still he tore a corner from the stale biscuit on the counter, crumbled it in his palm, and stepped out to scatter it along the porch rail. The bird flitted away at his movement, but he knew it would return. They always did. Back inside, the dough had risen just enough. A slow, content swell like a chest drawing in sleep. He floured the wooden board, turned the dough out with quiet care, and began to knead. The room was still. Even Jasper had stilled. Eyes closed, ears twitching only slightly at the sound of the palms pressing and folding. There was rhythm in it, not rushed, not demanding, just known. He remembered how she used to hum when she kneaded dough. Low, wandering notes with no song to belong to, just music for the air. When the oven warmed and the dough was shaped and rising again, Thomas wiped the counter clean and sat with the small notebook. Not his usual one, not the larger one he kept his reflections in, but the smaller tan one with a sprig of rosemary pressed into the first page. This one was hers, but blank. She had bought it at the farmer's market 2 summers before she passed, saying, "I want a place to gather the small things." She never got to fill it, so Thomas had begun doing so for her. Not with poetry, but with little notices of life. Today he wrote, "There is something in the act of kneading that quiets the body in places the mind cannot reach. I wonder if that's why you always look so peaceful after baking." The smell of bread began to spread, first at the edges of the kitchen, then down the hallway, then curling toward the living room like a child tiptoeing through the house. It was the kind of scent that doesn't ask for attention, but gathers it anyway. Warm, soft, inevitable. Thomas sat still for a moment longer before rising to check the oven. He opened the door gently, just enough to peer in. The crust had turned golden. The room seemed to exhale. He left it a little longer because that's what she would have done. She always said, "Wait until the house starts to feel like a story." When the bread was done, he set it on the counter to cool, wrapped in a tea towel with fraying edges and a faded pattern of tiny green pears. He didn't slice it right away, didn't need to. Sometimes it was enough to know that something warm waited for you in the next room. The sparrow had returned. It sat now on the railing, pecking gently at the crumbs he'd scattered earlier, its head tilted once toward the kitchen window, then back to its meal. And in that moment, Thomas smiled, not because it was remarkable, but because it wasn't. The smallest things often carried the most weight. He poured another cup of tea, this one with a bit of milk, and carried it to the porch. The bread would cool. The sparrow would finish its meal. Jasper would stir soon and stretch in that way dogs do when they've slept well and have no regrets. And Thomas, he would sit, hands wrapped around the warmth of the mug, eyes half closed, heart a little more settled, not because anything had changed, but because something had stayed. And as the afternoon light slanted long across the fields, he whispered quietly, "You would have liked today." The bread had cooled. It sat on the wooden board near the window, wrapped loosely in the old tea towel. Its warmth now a quiet memory held in the fibers of the cloth and the scent lingering in the air. The sky outside had shifted, just a little, from golden afternoon to a softer, more muted gray. Not threatening, not heavy, just gentle enough to suggest that rain might come. Thomas stood by the door with the loaf in his hands. He wasn't quite sure why he'd wrapped it in the good towel, the one with the faint embroidery she'd stitched into the corner years ago, a vine curling into a single sleeping rose. But something about it felt right. The act of giving, even something small, deserved care. Across the lane, just past the hedgerow that divided his field from the edge of Mrs. Dalrymple's property, light still glowed faintly in her kitchen window. She was well into her 80s now, and had lived in the white cottage across the lane since before Thomas and his wife had even considered settling here. There had always been a quiet companionship between the two houses. No grand gestures, just gestures that mattered. A pie left on the porch after a surgery. A jar of preserves when the tomatoes came in thick. A note tucked into the mailbox with a line of verse and a sprig of mint from the garden. Since his wife's passing, they hadn't spoken much. Not because of distance, but because grief sometimes respects quiet more than company. Still, Thomas had seen the way Mrs. Dalrymple looked toward his porch in the mornings, how she nodded at Jasper from across the fence, how the light in her home remained steady, like a watch kept not for time, but for presence. He pulled on his old coat, the one with the fraying cuffs and a button replaced long ago with thread too bright. It smelled faintly of cedar and stove smoke. Jasper stirred, lifted his head from the rug, but didn't rise. Thomas smiled. "No need for both of us to get our paws wet," he said softly. He stepped out into the evening, closing the screen door with the softest pull. The air smelled of damp earth. Not yet rain, but close. Each step on the gravel path was measured, not cautious, but reverent. These were steps taken without hurry, steps meant not to reach a destination, but to carry meaning from one porch to another. The bread was still warm in his hands, and he held it carefully, as if it were not only food, but memory. He passed the lilac bush, now mostly green, its blooms long gone, and touched one leaf as he passed. She had always paused here, always. "Even when it's not blooming," she once said, "it's remembering how." He crossed the lane slowly, the way people do when they're not crossing for errands but for something older, something closer to ritual than routine. Mrs. Dalrymple's porch light was on. It cast a soft circle on the painted boards, illuminating the flower pot she kept near the railing and the doormat with a faded hello worn down to almost nothing. Thomas didn't knock, didn't need to. Instead, he set the loaf down gently on the small wooden bench beside the door. He took a moment, adjusted the towel so the corners tucked in neatly, and laid a sprig of rosemary on top of the bundle. Then, from his coat pocket, he pulled a small piece of folded paper. Not a note, just a line from one of her old recipe cards he'd copied out in pencil that afternoon. Best enjoyed while the rain begins and the world feels like a room of its own. He tucked it beneath the rosemary, stepped back and looked once more at the quiet door. Then he turned and made his way home. The rain began just as he reached the porch. Not a downpour, not even enough to wet the collar, just the kind of rain that makes the trees lean in and the soil breathe deeper. He stepped inside, hung his coat by the door, and gave Jasper a small pat before settling again by the window. From there, he could see Mrs. Dalrymple's kitchen light, still glowing, and after a few moments, a flicker of movement, her hand perhaps, or the lift of the towel as she uncovered the bread. He turned away then, not because he didn't care, but because kindness, when given properly, doesn't need to be witnessed. He poured the last of the tea, sat back into the old armchair, and let the rain speak its soft language against the roof. The clock ticked, the wind moved gently through the trees, and somewhere across the lane a slice of bread was being warmed, and an old woman was reminded that she was not forgotten. In a world full of noise, sometimes the quietest gestures carried the deepest voice. And Thomas, wrapped in the hush of the evening, smiled to himself, not for praise, but for peace. The house was quiet in a way that made every sound feel like a kindness. The ticking of the old clock, the occasional rustle of Jasper turning in his sleep, the soft creak of the floorboards expanding against the settling cool. They were not disturbances, but reminders that time was passing gently, without rush, without demand. Thomas sat by the little desk in the corner of the room, the one with the worn drawer, handles and a small chip in the left leg, from the time they'd tried to move it without measuring first. He hadn't sat at this desk in weeks, maybe longer. It wasn't that he'd forgotten it. Somehow, furniture never let you forget, but he'd grown used to thinking of it as hers. She had kept her letters here, her old recipe cards, a stack of clippings from magazines no longer in print, and tucked into one of the narrow drawers was a brown paper notebook with the spine barely holding together. Tonight, after coming back from Mrs. Dalrymple's porch, after warming the tea again and turning on the amber lamp beside the chair, Thomas had opened that drawer, not intending to find anything in particular, only to sit for a while with something that had once felt like conversation. The notebook smelled faintly of lavender and dust. Its pages were soft with age, some slightly curled at the edges, others bearing the faint imprint of a pressed flower now long disintegrated. He opened to a page near the middle. Not chosen, just found. The ink was hers. Familiar loops and narrow slants that never tried to impress, only to speak clearly. The page began with a simple date, October 9th, a Thursday, rain in the morning, chilly by noon. He read, "I boiled potatoes with the skins on today, like we used to when we didn't have enough butter to waste on peeling. Funny how we called that making do, but I remember it tasting better than now, when I have more than enough of everything. The garden looked tired this morning, not sad, just spent, as if it had offered all it had and now wanted only to be left alone, with the last of the marigolds and one stubborn green tomato. I watched a young couple walk past the house today, him carrying a small dog in a blanket. It looked like a chore, but also like love. I think gratitude lives best when it doesn't have to say much. Just be there, like soup warming on the stove, or a hand resting on a shoulder, not to fix anything, but just to say, I'm here. Thomas read slowly, letting each line settle like dust on an old windowsill. He could hear her voice in every word, not in the way it had sounded, but in the way it had made him feel. Like home. He turned the page. There was a drawing there, a small pencil sketch of the kitchen table. Nothing elaborate, just the outline of the chairs, the old bowl that always sat in the center, and a steaming mug placed to the left where she always sat. Below it, she'd written, "There's a rhythm in old things, one that doesn't beg for attention, but hums in the background until you remember to listen." Thomas leaned back in his chair. The light from the lamp caught the side of his face, casting a faint shadow across the notebook. He didn't feel sad, not in the way people expected grief to be, loud or drowning. This felt more like a tide that rose gently around his ankles and carried him slow and steady back toward memory. The rain returned, soft at first, then steadier. It tapped lightly on the kitchen windows, then danced across the porch roof with a rhythm that made you want to sit still and say nothing. Thomas closed the notebook slowly, rested his hand on its cover for a long moment, and then placed it gently on the desk. He rose and moved to the window, watching the rain blur the world into something slower, softer. Across the way, Mrs. Dalrymple's kitchen light had gone out. Not all the way, just dimmed, a signal perhaps that the bread had been sliced and sleep was being considered. He smiled. That's all kindness really was, he thought. Small things done in the quiet that make the night feel less alone. Later, as he climbed into bed, pulling the quilt up to his chest, Jasper hopped up at his feet and settled quickly with a sigh. The rain continued. The house breathed around him. The old desk sat quietly in the corner, now not just a piece of furniture, but a thread, binding past and present with simple words on soft paper. And as sleep began to pull gently at the edges of his thoughts, Thomas whispered into the hush, "I didn't forget." It was just after 9 when Thomas stepped into the garden shed that morning. The sun had only recently climbed above the hedgerow, casting long strips of light across the lawn, each blade of grass holding a tiny droplet like glass. Jasper trotted alongside him, tail soft and steady, and paused at the doorway as if asking, "Are we going to sit, or is today for something else?" Thomas gave a half smile. He didn't answer out loud, didn't need to. The air inside the shed was cooler than outside, holding tight to the night's crispness. The faint smell of old pine shavings, iron, and worn-out paper still clung to everything. There was no mustiness, not really. It smelled like time. He stood there for a moment, just past the threshold, taking in the little room. The bench with its nicks and dents, the shelves that bowed slightly under the weight of small things saved, the tools, both used and unused, some still waiting for a job that had never quite come around. Nothing here was out of place, and yet, something in him stirred with a quiet urge to make space, not to throw away, not to erase, but to make room. He moved slowly, first gathering a cloth from the drawer, then brushing off the surface of the workbench. The dust lifted in soft little clouds, dancing in the slanting sunlight like lazy motes of gold. It wasn't neglect, just the kind of dust that settled even on the most beloved things. Thomas hummed as he worked, not a tune with words, but the kind of low vibration that lives in a man when he's doing something honest with his hands. He sorted a small collection of screws into an old ceramic dish, coiled a bit of twine and tied it neatly, stacked 3 empty jars into a little pyramid, and wiped down the shelf behind them. Each act took longer than it needed to, intentionally so, as if by stretching time, he could feel her hand beside his again, working in parallel. He imagined her picking up the same cloth and wiping the other side of the bench, pausing to point out a new crack in the wood, or to tell him she'd seen the first robin on the fence this morning. He didn't close his eyes. He didn't need to. The memory was clear without effort. After a while, he reached for the small wooden box on the top shelf. It was nothing fancy, just a box of cedar made decades ago. But inside were all the things that had once seemed too small to matter and too precious to part with. A broken watch chain, a thimble, a theater ticket from 1963, one button from his father's shirt, a tiny envelope with 2 pressed violets, the paper brittle, but the shape of each petal still intact. He didn't touch any of them. He just opened the lid and let the sight of them wash over him like rain over stones. Then he closed the box again, set it down carefully, and moved on. In the back corner, behind a row of dusty pots, he found an old broom. Its bristles were uneven, the wood slightly warped, but it held firm when O gripped it. He swept the floor slowly, in long, easy motions. The rhythm was comforting, like breathing, dust and tiny bits of leaf gathered into a quiet pile. A few stray nails clinked softly as he swept them into his hand. When he opened the door again to toss the dirt into the compost, the breeze caught the edge of his sleeve, and for a moment he stood there, just watching the trees shift in the wind. Jasper had moved to the patch of sun just outside the doorway, curled into a little crescent of warmth. The garden buzzed gently, not loud, not urgent, just a kind of sound that says life is still going on. Thomas leaned against the doorway. The shed behind him felt lighter, not empty, not bare, but somehow open. He didn't plan to use it differently. He wasn't making way for something new. But by dusting the shelves, stacking the jars, clearing the floor, he'd made space for a little more breath to move through the room. He thought then of how his wife used to rearrange the kitchen drawers every spring, not because they were messy, not because anything had changed, but because she believed that movement invited memory, that by shifting small things you stirred loose the good parts of time and gave them permission to return. Thomas stepped fully outside, closing the door gently behind him. He didn't lock it. He never did. There was nothing in there that needed protecting, only remembering. And memory, he'd learned, had a way of keeping itself. That afternoon, Thomas didn't do much. There were no tools to hold, no jars to clean, no notebooks to write in, and yet he found himself sitting on the porch, an old wool blanket over his knees, and a book resting on the arm of the chair beside him. He hadn't meant to read, but something in the air, in the soft hush of the wind through the cedars, suggested the day was asking for stillness, not silence. The book was one he had read before, many times in fact. Its cover had faded from green to a sort of brownish gray, and the pages had gone soft around the edges, like cloth that had been handled too many times to still be crisp. It wasn't a novel, nor a journal, just a book of thoughts, small ones, some only half a paragraph, but each of them carried weight. The kind of weight that doesn't press down, but rather settles in. He let the book fall open on its own. The breeze caught a page, flipped it back and then forwards, again, like a child unsure of where to land. It stopped on a short passage, no more than a few lines. Thomas didn't read it aloud. He simply looked at it, eyes moving slowly across the words. It was about shadows, about how the end of the day holds its own kind of clarity, not because the light is strongest, but because it is kindest. He smiled at that, closed the book, left it open-faced on his lap. From his seat he could see the garden. It looked a little wilder now, not unkempt, but free. The zinnias leaned a little with the weight of their blooms. The mint had crept past its border in soft, sprawling vines, and the rosemary, upright and quiet, held the sunlight in its silvery green tips. He took a slow breath, let it out even slower, not because he was tired, but because the moment asked for it. Jasper had chosen his place near the porch steps, head resting on his paws, watching the little patch of gravel that led to the shed. He hadn't moved since they'd come outside, except once, to lift his nose to the breeze, as if catching the scent of something remembered, but not quite grasped. Thomas reached down, his hand resting lightly on the dog's back, feeling the slow rise and fall of his breath. That was enough. No words were needed. The porch creaked softly under the shifting weight of the wind. Somewhere far off, a screen door clapped shut, then silence again. No one passed on the road. No birds sang at that hour. Only the rustle of dry leaves and the hum of something almost too low to hear. Maybe it was the earth itself. Maybe it was memory. Maybe there wasn't a difference. He thought of her, of course, not sharply, not with ache, but with a sense that she was, in some gentle way, a part of the air here, in the way the porch board sighed underfoot, in the old mug that still sat on the side table, in the cushion she had once stitched with blue thread, a little crooked in the corners but beautiful in its attempt. He didn't reach for more, didn't try to conjure her, or chase the image. He just let her be as she had always been, present in quiet places. The light began to shift around 4. It moved lower across the field, casting longer shadows from the fence posts, pulling gold through the tops of the trees. Thomas watched it without moving. It felt like a closing of something, not an ending, but a rest. The world didn't say goodbye in those hours. It just folded itself softly inward. As the sun touched the hilltop, he rose slowly, book still open in one hand, blanket sliding from his knees. Jasper stood too, stretching in that long, slow arc only dogs seemed to master. They walked back toward the shed, not to open it, not to enter, just to pass by. Thomas paused at the door, rested his hand against the frame, then moved on. He left the book on the porch table. The wind had stilled now, and the last of the light gathered at the horizon like honey in the curve of a bowl. That morning came quietly. The fog had rolled in before dawn, wrapping the field and porch and roof in a thick hush. Not the heavy kind that smothers, but the kind that invites stillness, like a warm blanket drawn gently over the waking earth. Thomas sat by the window, a mug of tea warming both hands, watching as the world beyond the glass held its breath. The garden was gone, for now. The shed, too, its shape blurred to a faint silhouette, edges softened by mist. Even the trees looked closer together, as if drawn in for a quiet meeting. The kettle had whistled earlier, breaking the morning silence with its small song. He'd risen slow and no need for rush, and brewed a pot of mint tea, the last of what he'd dried 2 summers ago. There was something about mint on a foggy day that felt steady, the way it lingered on the tongue, neither sharp nor sweet, just present. He let the steam drift up toward his face, eyes closed for a while, breathing in not just the tea but the rhythm of the moment, On the table beside him was a simple piece of paper, cream-colored, lined with the faintest bend in one corner from where it had sat, untouched for several mornings. Today felt like the right day for it. He reached for a pen, not his usual one, but the black fountain pen with the small silver clip, the one his wife had given him on his 60th birthday. Its ink always flowed a little too fast. It made a mess if you hurried, which suited him just fine. He began with the date. October 6th. That seemed true enough. He didn't check a calendar. If he was wrong, it wouldn't matter. Then, slowly, with pauses between each word as if waiting for them to come to him on the back of the fog, he wrote, "Dear Annie, I was thinking of you this morning while the mist was curling through the cedar grove. I don't know if you've ever seen fog like this in the city, the kind that erases the edges of things, not in a frightening way, but as if the world is softening for a moment, letting us look without needing to name what we see." He stopped, let the ink dry, then picked up again. "The garden is almost asleep now. The rosemary is holding on, and the kale, of course, always the last to let go. I found a small pot of your grandmother's lavender seeds on the shed shelf yesterday. I think I'll save them for spring. There's a good spot near the porch where they'd like the sun." He paused again, listening to the kettle settle back into silence, its warmth radiating across the counter. The wind stirred, just slightly. The fog outside shifted a little, revealing the outline of the garden fence, soft and gray against the silver air. He kept writing. "I don't write often, but I thought perhaps you might like to know the shed still stands, the porch still creaks, and there's still a light in the window most nights. Some things don't ask to be remembered, they just wait, quietly, until we look their way again. You're welcome anytime, of course. I'll keep the tea warm." He signed it simply, "With love, Granddad." No need for more. The letter said enough, and even if it never made its way into a stamped envelope, even if it lived only here on the table beside the tea, it had done its work. It had reached where it needed to. The fog began to lift, not all at once, not with drama or fanfare, but slowly, as if the world was exhaling. The garden came back bit by bit, a fence post here, a patch of mint there, the corner of the shed roof still damp from morning air. Jasper padded into the room, shook himself gently, and leaned his head against Thomas's leg. The old man set his mug down, rested a hand on the dog's shoulder, and looked out one more time. Nothing had changed, and everything had changed, the way it always does when morning turns into day, when silence holds you for just long enough to remember who you are when no one is watching. The day after the letter came with sunlight, soft golden light that spilled across the floorboards and rested on the old braided rug, as if it had been waiting there all night just to greet the morning. Thomas stood barefoot in the kitchen, one hand resting on the worn edge of the counter, his eyes half closed as he listened to the slow drip of water from the faucet and the hum of a house waking gently. There was no need to move quickly. There hadn't been for a long while. Still, he liked the rhythm of mornings, the small acts that tethered him to the hours ahead, filling the kettle, cracking the back door open for Jasper, slicing a pear even if he didn't quite feel hungry. Each movement was slow, not because he lacked strength, but because he had learned there was no need to rush through the parts that made life whole. The garden waited. He could see it from the window. Not in full, but enough. The rosemary glinted in the light, the mint catching the breeze, the shadows still long across the path. He thought of the letter again. It still sat on the table unfolded, its corners curling ever so slightly in the dry air of the room. He didn't plan to send it, and yet some part of him believed Annie might feel it anyway, as if a letter didn't need a stamp to be received when it was written with that kind of care. Jasper returned from the yard, his paws damp with dew. He gave a short, contented sigh and curled into the patch of sunlight that always found its way to the base of the cupboard around this time of morning. Thomas smiled, took another sip of tea, and sat by the window where the light filtered in through lace curtains his wife had once hemmed by hand. There were tiny imperfections in the stitching, a place where the thread had doubled, a corner folded slightly too tight. He had offered once to replace them. She had said no. Imperfections let the light in differently. That's what she'd said. He'd never forgotten that. Outside, a bird landed on the fence. A towhee, he thought. Though he wasn't certain, it chirped once, then again, then flew off without making much of a scene. Thomas watched the branch sway long after the bird had gone. Sometimes the echo of a moment lingers longer than the moment itself. He thought of the shed again, its quiet walls, the way it smelled of dry wood and soil, the little tin box where old seeds slept year after year. He hadn't opened the shed door today, didn't need to. It would be there when he was ready. Everything important waited in its own quiet way. As the sun rose higher, he noticed the pear slices on the counter were starting to brown. He didn't mind. He liked them that way, softened by time, a little sweeter in their imperfection. He picked one up, let it sit on his tongue for a moment before chewing slowly. The window creaked. Jasper shifted. The world kept turning, but gently, as if it, too, knew that some mornings are best left unhurried. There were no visitors expected, no plans written down. But he thought, perhaps today, he might walk to the back fence where the sumac had started to turn red in its yearly quiet celebration. Maybe he'd gather a few twigs, or just sit there for a while, watching the way the sky bent itself between the leaves. He didn't need more than that. He never really had. That afternoon, the light softened. It wasn't the golden hue of high summer, nor the dimming gray of early winter, but something in between, like the last breath of September folding itself into the hem of October. Thomas stood just beyond the porch, hands resting in his pockets, eyes on the corner of the garden where the mint used to grow thickest. For years, it had filled that patch, spilling over the stones, climbing toward the lilac hedge, its scent greeting him before he even turned the corner. But time, as it always does, had worn it down. The frost of last winter had taken most of it. A stray boot or two had crushed what remained. Still, the earth remembered. He knelt slowly, feeling the gentle pull in his knees, the steady resistance of age that no longer surprised him. In his hand was a small paper packet, creased at the edges, faintly yellowed, with a smear of old handwriting on the front. Mint, Annie's favorite, saved '09. He hadn't opened it in years, had kept it tucked in the old tin box on the shelf in the shed, beside a pencil stub and a button he couldn't place. Now the flap opened like a quiet breath, and the seeds poured into his palm. Small dark specks that barely caught the light. He pressed a finger into the soil, not deep, just enough, dropped in 3 seeds, then 3 more, then a pause, then 3 again. The breeze stirred his collar. Somewhere behind him, Jasper gave a low huff in his sleep. Thomas smiled. No fanfare, no monument, just a patch of ground and a handful of memory taking root again. He stayed there a while, not in prayer exactly, but in something close, a kind of gratitude that didn't require words, a knowing that what we plant, even in silence, has a way of returning when it's ready. He brushed the loose dirt over the last seed, pressed it down gently with his palm, then sat back on his heels and looked up at the sky. Clouds drifted slowly. The sun touched the tops of the trees with a kind of farewell, and the garden, as always, held it all without asking for more. He stood again, moving carefully but without pain, and as he turned toward the house, he glanced once more at the shed, its door slightly ajar, its hinges groaning just a little in the breeze. He'd leave it open tonight, let the cool air pass through, let the scent of earth and wood and old stories breathe freely beneath the stars. Inside, the kettle would soon hum, the dog would wake, the sky would darken, but here, at the edge of the garden, between the soil and the memory, something had begun again, not loudly, not quickly, but surely, like all things that matter. And so, as the light fades from the garden shed and the last warmth of memory settles quietly into the soil, we bring this story to a close. Thank you for being here tonight, for letting the stillness in, for letting something gentle reach you wherever you are in the world. May sleep come softly to you now, like leaves falling in slow motion, like the hush that follows the final note of a lullaby. You've carried enough today. Now you can rest. If this story brought you peace, you're warmly invited to share a thought in the comments below. What would you like to hear next time? Is there a place, a memory, or a whisper of a tale you hope I'll bring to life? Wherever your dreams take you tonight, may they be kind. Good night.